Eminences, Your Excellencies, friends and colleagues, it is a very great honor to be invited to share in this auspicious occasion. And I'm extremely grateful to the Senate Institute that I have been asked to be part of this celebration. It's an honor in a number of different ways. An honor to receive the hospitality of this university and this institute and of the people of Ghana. But a very special honor also because of my own veneration and affection for the late Professor Lamin Sanneh. I had the privilege of knowing him as a friend. He was a generous supporter, someone who contributed greatly to the discussions of my own Anglican Church, as well as to the wider agenda of building confidence and trust between Christian and Muslim communities worldwide. It's perhaps some tribute to his memory that I find I am still using his writings regularly in my own teaching in Cambridge and in London. And I want to begin with some reflections on certain aspects of his writing and research, which are relevant to the subject of this consultation on territoriality and hospitality. There are two aspects of Lamin Sanneh's thought which are deeply and immediately relevant to this question. One is that a strong focus in his writing was the need for global Christianity to understand that the center of gravity was not where it had been historically in the West and the North, and that Christians needed more and more to appreciate precisely the global character of Christian presence. But in addition to that, there was the more specific research which he conducted and often discussed and shared, research on the way in which communities that had become Christian, especially in Africa, took different approaches to how they were to speak about God. Did newly Christianized communities use their own language, literally, to speak of God, or did they borrow names for God from missionary bodies and cultures? In other words, when Christian faith arrived in cultures that were historically strange to European travelers, did those Christian cultures see themselves as dominant or as guests within that culture, learning to speak and not simply talking others into silence? Because part of the history of Christian mission in Africa and elsewhere, sadly, has often been talking other people into silence, rather than listening and learning how to speak. Those two themes in Professor Sanneh's work, I would say, highlight the two themes of our conference, specifically as regarding Christianity. And I'll come in a moment to some thoughts about the implications for interfaith conversation. First of all, the insistence that Christians in the global North learn again and again that they are no longer the dominant partners in a relationship of master and servant. Christendom, the idea that there is a territory belonging to Christians in the world, which has to be extended as if it were a kind of empire, that is an idea, thankfully, belonging to the past. The Christian message and the Christian presence cannot be an empire. It cannot be an exercise in domination, whereby the boundaries of a Christian territory are steadily pushed out until they involve control of the entire globe. And if we have learned anything in the last century or so of reflection on the history of colonialism, we have learned that the association there has often been between Christianity and colonial power has not served the integrity of Christians or the well-being of anyone else. And then, as regards the willingness of mission to learn new languages, we are reminded of a theme very dear to Professor Sané's heart, that hospitality is about learning to receive hospitality as well as to give it. That grace involves learning to be a guest as well as learning to be a host. And that learning to be a guest entails respect and gratitude towards those who are making space in their home for you. I'll return to both of those themes a little later in these reflections. But let me pause for a moment on this question of territory, why and how it matters, and why we have to think very critically about it. I've said that one of the errors which Christianity has historically been prone to is the idea that there is, in some sense, a Christian territory which has to be extended. Something rather different from sharing the Christian message universally, and something that has uncomfortably more to do with an idea of universal control, dominance, or hegemony. This theme was addressed in a very unusual and very striking way by one of the great Christian theologians of the 20th century, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who resisted the Nazis, who was eventually imprisoned for his complicity in the plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, and who was eventually executed shortly before the end of the Second World War in a German prison camp. In some of his last writings, Bonhoeffer himself speaks of the danger of a territorial mindset. Of course, he says, the Christian church occupies a space in the world. You can see where Christians are, certainly on Sunday mornings. One hopes that the answer is that they are at worship. Yet the church does not exist in order to take up space in the world, to say this is Christian territory. The church exists to say to the entire world, this is the sphere of God's action and God's grace and God's love. The church exists not in order to say something flattering, reassuring, or whatever to its own members. The church exists to say something challenging and transforming for the entire world in which it is set. So the church should never be preoccupied with defending its boundaries as if it were a kind of nation-state in danger of invasion. It should never allow its energies to be consumed in this defense of territory. And why is that? Bonhoeffer says it is something to do with the very nature of God. God does not need to carve out some part of the world in which he is sovereign, because God is present, sovereignly present, by his freedom and his grace in every part of his creation. God does not have to fight for space, because God is not a reality like us alongside other realities. God is the supreme, unique, undefended source of all things, needing no protection from us or from anyone else. Now, that insight about the connection between the nature of God and the nature of the Christian community rests upon the crucial insight that God is not simply one of us. God is not a very large reality compared with whom we are a very small reality. God belongs to another order of reality entirely. God is the source of all that is, depending on nothing but himself. And to understand this is to understand something of how idolatry works. Idolatry is the identification of God with some part of the world, with an image of the divine, with myself and my needs and my priorities, with the well-being of a nation or a culture. To identify God with any of those, and there are many more examples, is what idolatry amounts to. And this, I would say, is where the Christian and the Muslim agendas coincide very significantly. One of the greatest contributions made by Islam to the religious history of the world is the central insistence that idolatry must be avoided at all costs, and the insistence that to confuse God with what is not God is the beginning of all error and all evil. And that is an area where the Christian and the Muslim can heartily agree. God is what God is, and to confuse God with what God is not is to reduce God to our own level. But when we embark on this program of reducing God to our level, one of the things that can very easily happen is that we become territorial. That is to say, we assume that the reality of God is essentially bound up with my reality, the reality of my culture, the reality of my class or my race. I identify God with what is not God, and I assume that by defending my nation, my culture, my class, my race, I defend God. And if that comes to be the case, the world is trapped more and more deeply in irreconcilable conflict. Because by associating God with my own interest, my own territory, my own psychology or imagination, I give to that territory, that psychology, that imagination, a divine character, an absolute character, which does not belong to it. So perhaps that's one way of beginning to think about the themes of our conference. We are territorial and defensive about our territory to the extent that, consciously or not, we are idolatrous, identifying God with ourselves, our interest, and our agenda. Looking back at the history of Christian mission and Christian engagement outside the historic territories of Christendom, we can often see that identification at work. And I dare say that there are parallel stories to be told about the expansion of Islam. But what if we resist idolatry? What if we step back from this very seductive and attractive idea that God might be identical with us, with our interests? Then we learn to see and to imagine our world, our human world and the non-human world, rather differently. Instead of beginning with the question, where are the boundaries on the other side of which is darkness and godlessness, perhaps we should begin by saying the entire world that we see has been received, welcomed into the hospitality of God. It has been called into being, called into the presence of God. That's one way of understanding what creation itself means. A world is summoned into being in the presence of God, as if invited into love, into joy, into fullness. And so, resisting the temptations of idolatry and territorial anxiety, can we imagine afresh a world around us, a human world around us, full of things and persons invited into being by God? Now, when I begin to see my human neighbor as somebody who has received the divine invitation, to see my human neighbor as somebody who has been called into being into the presence of God, then I'd venture to say we see them very differently. The human other is no longer simply a stranger and a threat. The human other is the guest of God, the guest of God. And the material world which we inhabit, instead of simply being a storehouse of resources that we can use as we please to make ourselves comfortable, the material world itself comes to be seen as invited into being by God, called into God's presence so as to live and to flourish. And when I see the world around me as invited into being by God, once again, I see it differently. I see it as carrying the creative word of God. I see it as responding to God's invitation into reconciliation and joy. So what I'm suggesting is that when we are released from idolatry and from the territorial obsessions that go with it, what begins to happen is a transfiguration of our sense of the world around us. We see what is around us, who is around us, in terms of God's hospitality, God's welcome. For the Christian, that is expressed uniquely and fully in the way in which Jesus of Nazareth invites and receives and welcomes all those persons and things around him to bring to them the transforming love of God. And that is a theme which I believe we should be discussing and exploring together as persons of faith. Because insofar as all of us, Christians, Muslims, and others alike, believe in a God who is not part of the world, but rather invites the world into his presence, to the extent that we believe that, we can share and develop a transforming vision in our world. We can say to the world around us, we refuse to accept the terms of exclusion and fear, which are so common in that world. We can together nourish a vision of reality that is fundamentally generous, fundamentally welcoming. And that, of course, means the exercise of hospitality to one another. I've deliberately not begun with that idea of hospitality to one another, important as it is, because I think it is important to push back the notion of welcome and hospitality into our understanding of God's very activity. We are hospitable. We seek to welcome one another because we have been welcomed, we have been invited into the divine presence. Receive one another, says St. Paul in Christian scripture, as God in Jesus Christ has received you. The receiving, the drawing into the presence, begins with God's act, and we are called to reflect that in our relations with one another. Hospitality, then, rests on the very nature of creation. And both as created human beings and as persons of specific and explicit faith, we are to live in the truth of that hospitality, to live out of the reality of God's welcome. And so, we seek to welcome one another. It sounds straightforward, and of course, as we all know, it isn't. Every society seems to exist partly by the energy of fear. Every human society we know has shot through it some element of anxiety about the stranger who will compromise my integrity, who will fight me for my resources, and who will undermine my identity. And therefore I have to keep the doors tightly shut and the walls very high. Both Christianity and Islam are faiths with a universal perspective. Both believe that there is some state of reconciled, peaceful existence which is proper to all human beings, not just to one nation or culture. And that means that both faiths have a universal horizon which is always going to make life uncomfortable in a world of small and anxious states and societies. Our business as people of faith in this context is to come back at the assumptions I've just been outlining with the question, why are we afraid of the other? Why is it that we shrink back? Why do we not believe that our own identity and reality is so deeply secured in the gift and invitation of God that we do not have to be afraid for our identity in the face of the stranger? To put it very simply, it will take more than a stranger to undermine my identity, because my identity is called into being by God, and so is the stranger's. Whatever conflicts and difficulties we encounter on the way, that is the reality that underlies everything, and that is what spells out the work we have to do together. And that is not a particularly welcome message in an anxious world. At the moment, in countless countries throughout the world, the voices of fear and anxiety are prevailing. We are seeing, in the last decade or two, a fairly steady movement towards higher levels of self-protection, higher levels of suspicion and anxiety, and even hatred towards the stranger. Conflicts and inequalities which many of us thought had been dealt with decades ago have returned in full force and with great violence. If anyone is disposed to a simple confidence in human progress, I suggest a close study of international politics in the last decade. We are not getting more welcoming, more friendly, less suspicious, and less anxious. And this at a time when conflict and pressure on resources is leading to unprecedented numbers of displaced persons in our world. You won't need me to remind you that at the present time there are almost certainly more displaced persons on the face of the globe than ever before. And those millions who are away from their homes and their countries because of poverty, disease, or open conflict are people desperately and urgently in need of hospitality. In our own country, in the United Kingdom, we have had, in the last few years, repeated controversies about how we should deal with migrants. We've had, I would have to say, an embarrassingly thin and unsatisfactory response from government again and again on this subject. And yet, what is remarkable is that at grassroots level, so many people in our country as in other countries, faced with the human reality, the face-to-face reality of the stranger, will still be inclined to take the risk of welcome, the risk of hospitality. Because it is a risk, certainly in the kind of world we inhabit. 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting in Cambridge discussing aspects of the refugee challenge in the United Kingdom. And the most effective intervention in that discussion came from a Jewish woman in Cambridge who told the story of how she had responded to an invitation from a refugee charity to take into their homes migrants from Syria. The Jewish woman told the story of how she had gone to meet her Syrian Muslim refugee with great trepidation and great uncertainty. And she went on to describe the friendship that had developed between them and the way in which her guest had transformed her understanding not only of Islam, but also of her own Jewish identity, and even more, of her human identity. And she spoke of how that Syrian guest had gone on to be at home in British society as the years went on. An unusual story, but not a unique one, but one that reminds us that the attitudes of anxiety, hatred, and suspicion are not the only ones that are possible for human beings. The mutual transformation of hospitality, learning more about myself as I learn more about a guest, learning more about my host as I learn how to be a guest. Those realities are possible once we break through the prison of what I've been calling idolatry. The identification of myself, my agenda, my literal physical territory, my culture, with the divine and the absolute. God alone is God. And what makes that to be good news for us is that none of us has to try to be God, to stand in God's place, and that none of us, therefore, has to defend ourselves as if we were defending God. So perhaps you'll see how from some of those insights which were so dear to Professor Sané's heart, a kind of broad moral vision emerges for our work together as people of faith. We learn, in reflecting on the nature of our God, we learn something about how to resist idolatry. We learn from resisting idolatry something about the nature of creation. God, who owes us nothing, has of his free love summoned reality into life. We are all of us guests of God. And as we learn how to be guests of God, subjects of God's welcome, we learn how to see one another in that light as invited by God, and the world itself as invited into being by God. And we learn that our own agenda, desire, craving, security is not something that we have to pursue at the cost of our human neighbours or at the cost of the earth we live in. The unhappy paradox of the last few years is that the resurgence of anxious and defensive attitudes towards the other and the stranger has occurred just at the time when we've become more than ever aware of how intricately our world is interdependent. We're meeting at a time when the world appears to be facing a new pandemic of disease. And if we had not learned this already, we are learning it literally today, that pandemic disease pays no attention to political or social boundaries. But we should be learning all manner of similar things also. If disease knows no boundaries, likewise environmental degradation and threat knows no boundaries. The environmental crisis is no better at reading maps than pandemic disease. The economies of the world, we know, are linked together as never before. And whatever the myths that are propagated in some high places, it is in the long run impossible for one society to be secure and prosperous while others fail and decline. In the world we are now in, the good of each and the good of all are much more obviously interconnected than we might have suspected even a century ago. The reality we live in, the reality of environmental degradation and pandemic disease, of poverty and crisis and violence, the world we live in is teaching us, in a most unwelcome way, some theological truths. And the challenge we face at the moment as a human family, I would say, is whether we are willing to learn those lessons, to allow ourselves to be taught by these crises something about the necessity of freeing ourselves from idolatry, freeing ourselves from the territorial obsession and the myth of self-sufficiency, freeing ourselves from the dangerous picture of the world which imagines that your suffering has nothing to do with me and that my prosperity has no impact for you. In the Gospel of St. Luke, Jesus famously says at one point, when the rich man in hell prays that help will be sent to his surviving brothers, they have Moses and the prophets, let them listen to them. In other words, we have from God, through Moses and the prophets, through all the history of revelation that we have received, we have the truth set before us. The truth about the nature of creation as something invited into being by the free love of God. We have the truth of our interconnectedness set before us in various ways. The truth that none of us lives or dies alone. And yet we repeatedly choose to turn aside from that revealed truth and take refuge in the myths that are more comfortable for us. And so the effects of our untruthfulness and our idolatry come back to us in the form of medical crisis, environmental crisis, political instability, and all that we now face. We have not listened to Moses and the prophets. Can we now listen to the call of a global crisis and recover once again a sense that we are all of us, including our material world, we are all of us guests of the divine love, and all of us called to show hospitality in the name and power of that divine love to each other. The foundation of this institute is, in these difficult times, a sign of hope, a reminder that we do not have to be prisoners of our mythology, that faith can still break through the prisons we've been reflecting on. My prayer and my hope for this institute is that it may do full justice to the memory of an unusual, creative, and in every respect great scholar and believer, and may have the impact it deserves to have on a world so desperately in need of liberation from its fantasies of self-sufficiency and division, and in need of recovering the good news of God's welcome and the strength and freedom to share that welcome with one another. Thank you.